Hello, this lecture is on slavery in the New World. Um, I have to say at the start, this is probably one of the least favorite lectures I have to give. It's not a fun lecture. Please excuse me if I ramble a bit because it is a difficult subject to talk about. Please do your best to just stay with me on this. So, as I talked about in the previous lecture, Europeans are going to go out and explore, right? They want to figure out ways to get at the Indian Ocean trade. They want to get direct access to those silks and spices and things like that. And they're going to actually go out and conquer areas as well, right? Because remember, they're militarily powerful. Now, the thing is, in the 1500s, they can't just come in and conquer a bunch of Africa and Asia. African and Asian civilizations are just too powerful, right? So even though Europeans can kind of come in and force their way into the trade networks, they really can't do more than seize a few cities and focus on trade. There's no way in the 1500s that they can come in and conquer India or conquer China or conquer any of the powerful African kingdoms like the Congo Kingdom. They can't do that. The military technology gap is just not wide enough. So they're able in Africa and Asia, Europeans can come in, they can maybe conquer a few cities, something like that, but they're just mostly there to focus on trade. In the Americas, it's completely different. The technological difference between the Europeans and the native inhabitants is huge. We talk a lot about this in History 121, but the Aztecs, the Incas in particular, these are very powerful empires, but unfortunately for them, they did not develop metal working, right? So their weapons were mostly made of stone, and they also did not have horses, whereas Europeans were really good with horses. They had steel armor, steel swords, and gunpowder. And so that technological difference is significant. In addition, something like 90% of native peoples in the Americas were killed by disease. So basically, Africans, Asians, and Europeans had hundreds of years, actually thousands of years, where they were trading diseases back and forth, and they were building up immunities. But basically, the poor Native Americans got hit with thousands of years worth of Asian, African, and European diseases all at once. And like I said, it killed something like 90% of the people. So what this is going to allow is then for especially the Spanish and the Portuguese and later on the English and to a certain extent the French are going to be able to come into the Americas, take over, colonize those areas, and begin to extract resources. Now, initially, there's going to be there's a kind of a problem because in a sense there's a labor shortage, right? There are lots of resources, but a lot of people have died. The native peoples have died, and so are not available to extract those resources. So while the Spanish and the Portuguese in particular, though the English to a certain extent, are going to force native peoples to carry out labor for them. So for example, a lot of Spanish colonies, they have a labor tax. So free Native Americans who lived in the territory controlled by the Spanish would be required to do a certain amount of work for the government. But there weren't enough, right? There were not enough people to do all the labor that the Spanish wanted to be done. And they did attempt to enslave Native Americans, but Native Americans knew the area well. They could just run away, and that's what a lot did. So basically what happens is in the Americas, you have a labor shortage, right? You have, in a sense, this huge territory, which there's still native peoples around, but a lot of them have died. It's kind of been depopulated. The Europeans want to start bringing in labor to work, and there's not even enough Europeans, right, to colonize all the land and to do all the labor that could be done. Now, labor works in kind of a supply-demand curve. You probably have studied this in economics, where if labor demand is high and labor supply is low, that means wages go up, right? If there's not many workers but lots of work, that means you should have to pay your workers more. The problem is in pre-modern societies or early modern societies, one way you deal with a labor shortage is slavery. Oh, we don't have enough people to work, or we don't have enough people who want to work for the wages are there. Let's enslave some people, right? We're going to force people to do the work for us. And it's kind of, like I said, this is a difficult lecture to give. It's very sad. It's a simple economic issue in a sense. You have a labor shortage. What do? Well, we just force people to work. We treat people as property, basically. And that's how you solve it. It's a simple solution. It's also kind of an evil solution. So of course, when I talk about slaves, a lot of these people who are going to be enslaved are Africans. That's the vast majority. Sometimes you have native peoples and things like that, but it's mostly going to be Africans. Now, there's problems when we use the term slavery and the term slave, because a lot of times when we do that, we're thinking of the American experience, what happened in the United States, right, to African Americans, black people, people of African descent. And slavery is very complex. Slavery is different things in different places. So, for example, in the ancient Roman Empire, slavery was common. There was a lot of slavery. It goes up and down, depends on the time period. But the thing about the Romans was it was not racial slavery. Romans did not care what race you were. If they defeated you in war and conquered you, they were happy to enslave you. So the Romans' slaves were very diverse. It wasn't racial or ethnic. It was just whoever lost a war, boom, they could be enslaved. In Korea for many hundreds of years had lots of slavery, but they enslaved other Koreans, right? And it was typically people who got into debt or who could not feed themselves would end up becoming slaves. But there was actually a significant number of them. But Koreans enslaved other Koreans, so it was even within the same ethnic group. And what things makes really complex, and I wish we had more time, we could talk about them, but in Mamluk Egypt, the army were technically slaves. The military were technically slaves, and then they eventually, because they were military, they seized power. So even though they were technically slaves, they were the ones in charge. And one thing I should point out about slavery, I don't have it up there, but if you're familiar with Anglo-Saxon England, that's England before 1066, they had slavery as a punishment for crime. And sometimes it was temporary. So like, let's say someone did something, let's say someone burned down your house, right? That person might be punished by being your slave for a few years. You know, they'd have to help you rebuild your house and do other work to pay back the damage they did, right? They don't have prisons. So slavery kind of makes sense as a way of punishing people. So I just want to stress, slavery is very diverse. It's not always like what we had in the United States. What we had in the United States was particularly terrible compared to other forms of slavery. It's all bad. Except for maybe the Mamluks. I'm not sure. That, like I said, that's a complex case. But in the United States, it was really terrible. But it's not always like that. So in particular, we want to talk about Africa. So in Africa, similar to Rome, there was a history of enslaving war captives, right? 2 tribes or 2 states, Africans formed governments in different places. If they got into a war and one side won, they got to enslave the other people. And like I said, that's very similar to what the Romans did. And again, I'm not trying to justify that, but kind of the idea is that, you know, we won the war, you know, we get the people. And yeah, that's basically how things were done. And so if this happened to you, you didn't necessarily think it was unjust. You just were like, oh, it's too bad. It was bad luck for me. But, you know, people went into this with the expectation that that's what might happen. In any case, there was a history of enslaving war captives in Africa, which is fairly common. Now, usually, a lot of times what happened to these war captives, especially if they were women, was they were integrated into existing households. So again, when you think of American-style slavery, you may think of a big plantation, and then there's like slave quarters. And so the slaves are kind of separate. And, you know, even though there was in actuality mixing, ideally, I should say ideally like that. What I mean is that in the ideal, you know, the African slaves had their own area, and then the white plantation owners had their area, and they didn't intermingle. That's not how Africa worked, right? Slaves were often members of households and would often be married to free people, right? And it was common to, polygamy was common, so, you know, a man could have multiple wives, some of whom would have been slaves who had been captured in battle. Now, again, I'm not trying to justify any of this, of course. I'm just trying to explain how this worked and how it was different. What's key, though, about this, over time, these people might cease being slaves. So you might get, if you're, especially I'm using the case of women, because in part we'll look at a book called Being and the Important Men that looks at example of slavery with a woman. If you're a woman and you become enslaved, you might be forced to marry a man and have children with him and be part of his household, but you might over time be recognized as a free person in your own lifetime, right? So slavery was not necessarily a permanent thing. And this is very different from the United States, right? In the United States, you're a slave. You're likely born a slave. You're going to die a slave. But already we can see something a little bit different here, right? If you were an African slave in Africa, you had more of a chance of having something of a place in society, a low place, but not necessarily the lowest place, and not, like I said, as bad as what you'd have in the United States. What's especially interesting is usually the children follow the status of the father. So you're an enslaved woman, you're married to a free man, your children will be free. Again, this is different from American-style slavery, where the children would also be slaves. The children will often be free. So my point here is just, this is how slavery was working in Africa. Now, here's the thing that sometimes happens, though. Sometimes they're in a war, and they capture, Africans will be in a war, and they'll capture more people than they really need as slaves, and they will start to sell them to Islamic countries, and later to European countries, right? So they'll have these slaves that they don't necessarily need. These will be sold to Islamic and later European countries. Now, this creates a big problem for those slaves, right? Being a slave is bad, don't get me wrong, but there's different degrees of badness. Being a slave enslaved by people who are similar to you, who speak the same language as you, who or a similar language, a lot of the African states, they were similar, being integrated into a household, that's not great, but it could be worse. And being sold when you're an African into the Middle East or to a European country or into the United States, that's going to be really bad, because the slavery is going to be much, much more harsh, because these are not people like you, right? It's just how human beings are. We tend to be nicer to people like us, right? And you're not going to be able to integrate into those countries. You're not going to, again, if you go to the United States as a slave and you have children, your children are going to be slaves too. So it's different. And what's going to eventually happen is slaves will be actively sought, right? Because of the immense profits they can bring, right? So what's going to end up happening is eventually, because Europeans especially, but also more slaves will be actually sold to Islamic civilization, but in any case, huge numbers in both sides. There's so much money to be made selling slaves, and you can get things in like gunpowder weapons and advanced technology, especially from the Europeans, that eventually African kingdoms will start fighting wars to get slaves, right? Slaves used to be kind of a byproduct of wars. Eventually, those slaves will be actively sought because you can get immense profits from them. So that's how we're going to start having this demand for labor by Europeans, especially. Like I said, the Islamic slavery comes first. They enslave a huge number of people, but also we're going to have the same thing with Europe. This demand for slaves to work in the Americas is going to lead to an increase in the search for slaves in Africa. Right? So this is a very profitable system, but this profit comes at the pain, of course, of the poor slaves.